I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're basically here to talk about the securing the future of education and navigating cybersecurity for education leaders. My name is Tim Watrous. I'm the president of Digital Advisors. I've been in the technology industry for 25 or so years. Worked for big tech companies like Cisco Systems, sure you've heard of them, the internet company. I was always in a role where I supported education and helped the big tech companies better understand what school districts were going through at a given time, and would help education leaders better understand how the big companies were positioned to help them solve the challenges they were facing. I left 4 or 5 years ago to do good things in education, and one was to start Digital Advisors. We bring technology expertise to school districts when they have a hard time finding it, and we help with lots of things like big projects, anything like putting in your own cellular network to inventory management, assets, and budgeting for those things, technology teams and structures, lots of fun things. And of course, one of the other big ones is cybersecurity that we're all here to talk about today. So with that in mind, I want to go ahead and have my colleagues introduce themselves. And maybe Randy, we could start with you and then move on to Brian.
Sure. Hi, my name is Randy Bassett. I am a former Chief Technology Officer, Associate Superintendent of Business Services, and I retired a year ago from being a superintendent for 6 years with the Fontana Unified School District, now pursuing other things, including helping out others come into the next era as far as schools go and bringing the best to our students.
And hi, good morning. I'm Brian Rohde, and I started my career in the private sector. Some of you may be familiar with Pelco Systems, and they built the industry's best security cameras for many, many years. And later moved into the SLED space, where I held a multitude of roles: Chief Information Security Officer, Network Manager, Network Engineer. And today I provide virtual CISO services for a multitude of schools and SLED organizations. Really looking forward to sharing some best practices with you this morning.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, so let's go ahead and jump in here. And I just want to run through our agenda. We've got some good topics to dig into here, and just quick little overview for those of you that saw it in the CASBO newsletter. I was talking to Tasha Davenport, the executive director of CASBO at CSBA, and she was mentioning how she just wanted some more cybersecurity content. So we wrote a couple of articles for them in their newsletter that went out, and this is an extension of that to get beyond just sort of something that you could read and have a chance to hear from some experts and do a Q&A at the end. But we talked a little bit about in some of the articles that you may have read. We talk about things like digital health and due diligence. What is our digital identity? What does that mean in today's world? We'll be talking about things like navigating roles and access, and outsourcing technology expertise, which is commonly used in enterprise and in commercial. We don't see it used as much in education. And then we'll jump into some free resources that you can use to help you tackle some of the challenges you're facing today. And then we're going to save a little bit of time to do some Q&A with our group here. So looking forward to doing that, and let's go ahead and dive in. So, by the way, the chat is at the bottom of Teams if you're not super familiar with it, and you'll see the two people icon. If you want to drop any questions that you have in there, please feel free, and we'll be addressing some of those at the end. So let's talk about the term digital health and due diligence, like why we're starting there. And I like to compare our digital health to our physical health. So when we think about our physical health, we need to get the right amount of sleep. We need to drink water. We need to eat our vegetables, go to the doctor, go for walks. And we need to put measures in place to stay healthy physically. And when you think about our digital selves, all of our banking, our loans, our credit cards, the Venmo sorts of things in the world are all digital. And we have this digital self, this digital identity that we need to worry about and keep healthy. And that gets a little trickier as time moves on, because there's all these things that we get to worry about now in terms of keeping that healthy. And we'll dig into some of that today. But when we talk about due diligence, Brian and I were on a call with Small School Districts Association with the superintendents there. And one of the soups asked a great question. They said, what's my due diligence? What do I have to do to know that I'm doing what I should be doing for cybersecurity? And with that in mind, I think there's a couple of guiding areas that we can look at. And one is the CDE. I want to say a month or so ago, California Department of Ed came out with some cybersecurity guidelines that every school district can put in place to make sure they are have a reasonable level of cybersecurity. And CISA, who's our federal agency who's in charge of or who's looking after cybersecurity for us, they recently came out with a report focused just on education that has an executive review, and it also has recommendations and does get technical as well, but there's stuff for non-technical folks in that report. And I think those are two good places to start when we think about where's that due diligence. It's not as comprehensive as some of the others things that you can comply with, but those are a couple of good baselines to get started. And with that in mind, there's a lot on technology's plate today. And some of the folks on this call today may be tech folks, or you feel for the tech folks in your school districts. But there's a lot of pressure on tech. And Randy being in the tech department and the CBO and the superintendency for so long, can you talk about what that pressure is like on tech folks today to know and do all things?
I think it's a challenge. Some may feel sometimes it's an insurmountable challenge, but we don't think so. But the pressure is really increased. We had to change how we did business. Everyone knows that when we had to go to remote learning. But just to put a little bit of a picture on it as far as the additional pressures in the devices that we've added, what do we do with those now? When you walk a classroom and you walk into the classroom and they're still trying to do distance learning instead of the typical instruction, how do we actually support that? How do we keep on moving forward? I was looking at the data the other day as far as how expenditures have changed over the past 4 years. Those expenditures on technology have gone up over 61%. Support personnel to address that has gone up in California by just under 13%. So balancing those things out, there's a lot of pressure on tech as far as delivering, having higher expectations as far as how we deliver services, moving things forward, but just also understanding that we want to collaborate and what do we do with all this infrastructure that we brought in.
Well, thanks for that, Randy. And I guess, if you're familiar with cybersecurity, one of the key takeaways from all this, and we'll be focusing on this today in the webinar, is one of the biggest risks to our cybersecurity is ourselves, and it's our staff, it's our students, it's our guests that are using the networks and how they behave. And as a leader, no matter where you are in the district, and you've got teams, and you're trying to help people understand what some of their priorities are. Getting people to care about their role in keeping our data safe is important. And when you have all these, priorities in a school district, it can be challenging, I think, to help people focus in on something like this that people are worried about, but they don't know how worried they should be. So, Randy, can you talk with your experience as a superintendent on how do you get people to care about something that is so important like cybersecurity in today's world?
I think it's something that's meaningful for everyone. So when you talk about cybersecurity, it's, we've had districts go through some big challenges. We've had districts that have been shut down for months at a time as far as access to those resources. We are so dependent on those things right now. It has a personal impact, whether you're talking about personal identities, social security numbers, how we present ourselves. As an organization, our security and how we're viewed digitally is becoming more and more important. Can I trust you with my child's data? Are you somebody that is moving things forward? Do you have a grasp on what you're doing and moving things forward? So it really is a challenge for everyone overall, and it is something that's very important. But really getting together and talking about what those concerns are and having those open conversations is one of those things that is necessary for everybody to understand where everyone is coming from and how we address the issues. And sometimes we don't even see the issues unless people bring them to us.
Well, thanks. I know there's a lot of finesse in that leadership, and there's a lot of things that folks to care about today. But like you said, there's so many examples of when cybersecurity goes wrong, and everyone on this call is trying to avoid that. So I like to start with this about getting people to care is passwords. And I don't know if everybody on the call remembers, but it wasn't that long ago that people like to use the word password as password, or like a superhero name. Of course, applications that we use today have forced us to use tougher passwords. But it wasn't that long ago when people would come in and kind of kick the door down in the leadership department and complain about having to use a tougher password. And I think we're still kind of in that world. I mean, I'm a person, you're a person. How many times do we forget our password and have to reset? And we just have to do this like namaste breath and get ourselves back to the password so we can get into the thing. It's sort of like the bane of our existence, but this thing that we have to live with today. And I think that those are the types of feelings that are rooted in people when we're trying to get them to care, right? Because you have this experience, you have these frustrations, and we need to convert that frustration into concern for their data and their students' data, and really trying to work together to keep that safe. So I'm going to move on from this and jump into multi-factor authentication. And I want to start by saying, if anyone was at CSBA, you might have heard Alberto Carvalho address the entire conference and talk about the experience from within Los Angeles Unified School District, which is one of the most notable hacks in recent memory. And he had a very heartfelt story about what it's like to be on the inside of a breach like that. They were working with the federal government. They were negotiating with hackers. And, as a best practice, they did not pay the hackers the ransom that they were demanding. And the hackers then, unfortunately, published sensitive data for students and administrators and all kinds of folks throughout the district. And that's just a horrifying thing that everyone wants to desperately avoid. And part of Alberto's message was, that they were in the process of rolling out multi-factor authentication. So we just talked about people's kind of frustrations with passwords. We're adding a layer now with multi-factor authentication. And for those of you that don't know, it's the extra check, right? Like, I'm going to sign in. By the time I remember my password, it's going to send me a text message or another way, send something to my email. And I'm going to put a code in, for example, to give me that extra layer of authentication. But, Brian, I want to go to you here on this, because multi-factor authentication is not something that you just turn on. It's not just a switch you turn on. Because like the passwords, when things would change, people can get frustrated. It's more of a journey, and maybe you could enlighten us on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. What this really is we want to get to a place where we begin securing the human. And a lot of the other points that we'll talk about today are going to be surrounding securing the human. But MFA is one of those things where I'm yet to see an assessment, an outside assessment, or perform an assessment on my own where MFA isn't one of the top 5 factors of implementation. And as Tim stated, a very, very large school district was facing with this. They were in the process of enabling it. And unfortunately, when you get these assessments back, it merely states enable MFA. And it really appears as though it's something where you can just flip it on like a light switch, and you turn it on and it works. And that's somewhat true, more false than true, I will say. And really what happens is if you turn on MFA without really testing and have a clear plan on how you want to roll it out, things will break. And what happens now is you have unintended consequences because you were trying to fix one thing, but you caused a different problem. And it happens all the time in IT deployments. So really, MFA is so much more of a journey in getting it to function within the organization. MFA is not convenient. So what happens is users have to change their day-to-day use. And as Tim stated, people are already frustrated with long passwords or complex passwords. This is another layer of that authentication process. So really, this is the implementation of MFA it's an educational effort, and it's a change management effort throughout the organization. The team has to be trained and they have to be comfortable. There has to be a very, very clear plan in terms of how are we going to roll this out and what does it look like? What's the backup plan in the event that the MFA technology doesn't work? Because if it doesn't function properly, then you lock people out from being able to log into their systems. So ultimately, it's a holistic plan. It's not something that you go in and ask your engineers to just turn on. It's something that takes consideration, care, and an entire project in order to make sure it's successfully deployed.
Well, thanks for that, Brian. And I don't know if anyone's looked at their cyber insurance bill lately, but reading articles about this and staying up to date, this is sort of a big news topic, right? The insurance costs are skyrocketing somewhere in the neighborhood of 200% because education is such a rich target for hackers. So this is extra scary because your rates are going up. They're also getting more strict about compliance and the things that you need to do to be compliant with your insurance policy. And if it's not something that you've checked recently, you really need to check. But Brian, can you talk about some of the challenges? Because we think about being compliant with insurance and then being compliant with some of the other standards and things that we put in place. And there's any number of places we can aim to be compliant. But just talk about the struggles of a school district in compliance today.
Yeah, the landscape is really changing. I want to use the word lucky. We've been lucky in SLED for a long time where compliance really wasn't that big of a deal because audits weren't being taken seriously or they weren't really being composed at all. And we're seeing a significant change in that. And the first place we're really seeing that change is in insurance. And cyber insurance and cyber liability insurance is really becoming like any other insurance where there's an underwriting process. And in that underwriting process, there's typically a questionnaire that's provided to organizations that fill out basic cyber questions on your cyber hygiene. Are you doing these particular things? What does it look like? If you're not doing them, when do you intend to have them in place? The more concerning piece about that is right now that's just self-auditing. We're not seeing a lot of physical auditors come in until there's a problem. And if you misrepresented the implementation of those underwriting requirements, we're seeing more and more that cyber liability claims are not being fulfilled. And that's a really scary place to be because for a really long time, what was taking place in SLED was we literally used it as what it was as an insurance policy. And we just figured, oh, we'll be the victim of a crime, yet they will just go ahead and fulfill the claim. So if it costs us, $20,000 internally, but it's $1 million claim, it's not really that big of a deal because the insurance is just going to take care of it. And that's really not the case. So what we're looking at now is how do we intertwine compliance and underwriting and all of these things, and it's determining what we do first. And we really want to look at it from a risk-based approach. And it's saying that we may not fulfill certain compliance areas because underwriting requires this particular thing, so we'll do that first. So it's looking at compliance and insurance holistically, along with your existing cyber hygiene, and kind of determining where are we really at risk and how do we prioritize these risks so we can start attacking these things in a very thoughtful manner.
Well, thanks for that, Brian. And yeah, it is a scary thing, but it's one of those things where once you know that you need to know the work that you put in to find out if you're compliant, especially with that insurance policy, is very, very important in today's world. So definitely make sure you put that on your to-do list when you come up for air and have a few moments. As we're preparing for this, we were talking about all the policies that you have in a school district. And Randy, you know this better than anyone. When we talk about getting people to care and kind of like feeling like they're on a team to protect each other's data and their students' data, thinking about a digital health policy I think is a best practice school districts can adopt. And Randy, maybe you kind of jump in here and talk about how you might position something like this as a superintendent and leader when you're trying to get people to care and trying to get them to kind of rally around a cause like this.
Sure. I think that we're familiar with all kinds of policies, plans that we have in place. We have school safety plans. We have acceptable use policies that are required as far as how we are supposed to be using some of our data. But in many cases, if you go back and you take a look at that, those are reactionary things that react to an event. And that is necessary, that on the digital side as well, as far as looking at how do you actually approach when a breach happens. But what is your policy as far as how you approach data, how you approach your information, and what you're going to do organizationally? So approaching that, I think it's really important that you work with all the stakeholders, whether it's parents. Absolutely, your bargaining units are going to be key to that because their information is very important out there. Their information is at risk. But bringing all those stakeholders together and talking about what those risks are, just having open conversations and talking about how we can approach and work together as far as addressing some of these things. Once you have that collaborative environment working together as far as addressing that and acknowledging that these are challenges, are a way that you can come to have a digital health policy. This is how we want to handle information. This is why it's important. This is who it's important to, and we need to consider that for all the stakeholders involved.
Well, thanks, Randy. And I know it's competitive in the education space for teachers in today's world, and highly qualified candidates for roles. And in your experience, you used to take people to like Tesla on a factory tour, and you would use that as a competitive advantage for Fontana to attract top talent. And I think a policy like this, it sort of in a good way gets people to want to do something and rally around a cause, rather than telling someone they need to do something, kind of getting them to want to do it. And that's one of those subtleties of leadership that I know very, very well. And then also, like, I think it could be potentially a selling point for folks to differentiate your district from someone else who hasn't really thought this through and hasn't prioritized this in the same way. So let's move forward and talk about our digital identities. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about our digital health, right? And who we are online, how we exist online, and trying to keep that safe. And if you have read any stories about cybersecurity as individuals, we are being approached by hackers in very clever ways, and they are very creative about coming up with new ways to get you to not only click on something that you shouldn't, which we know is phishing, but to get to give up information or do something that you wouldn't want otherwise do. And I want, Brian, I'd love to go to you here. And, you kind of read about the new methods and tactics, but can you talk to us about how that's evolved and what are some of the new methods and tactics that these hackers are using today to get people to give up information that they wouldn't otherwise give up?
Absolutely. I'm going to start with a little history, and that is cloud computing. And cloud computing has really changed the landscape in a very positive way on what we do in our day-to-day lives from a IT standpoint. It helps with efficiency, cost reduction, et cetera. But what it's also done is it's allowed the hackers to use some very interesting techniques, because we're so used to having all these different login screens, and we're very, very busy in our day. And ultimately, what the hackers have begun doing is looking at your LinkedIn profile, and they're looking at your Facebook, and they're learning who you are as a person. And gone are the days of this idea that it's some nerd in the corner with a hood on in a dark basement writing code and sending out these automated bots to hack your system. Today, it's a person. It's a person, and more importantly, it's a team of people that are going in and they're looking at your identity as a human, and they're using that against you. So they're doing targeting phishing attacks. We actually call them spear phishing, and they're using your own identity and your own things that you're putting out in social media against you to gain trust. And when you see something that looks incredibly familiar, you're much more likely to click on it. And what's happening today is hackers are no longer breaking in, they're logging in. And what I mean by that is, once you go to a nefarious website and you enter your credentials, a lot of the times you don't even know that's taking place. And then suddenly they're out on the web and they're being used, and they're being used against us. And the hackers are now just logging straight into your system.
Well, thanks for that, Brian. And yeah, it's a scary thought. People misrepresenting themselves online, digging through some of the things that we're putting out there so that we can participate in these communities and richly participate. And now we got to start thinking about, what am I putting out there that might put my digital identity at risk? And again, we're going to overlay that onto the school district and start thinking about, as employees and, the deluge of emails and things that you get in a day, or requests that you get in a day, and now social media, which we kind of control, but it's like our work presence, for example. It gets tricky. And I think the way, we put this in the second article for CASBO was, embrace your inner skeptic, right? Add a layer of skepticism that you didn't have before. And you don't want to completely color your lens when you're looking at the world. But in this digital space, we do need to be more skeptical, because there are these attempts at social engineering where folks are really trying to misrepresent themselves. So we believe we're communicating with a colleague. However, it's someone who's trying to get us to do a thing or give up information. And if it seems wrong, it's okay to take the time to go check in today's world. And if anyone gets frustrated with you about that, they should probably watch this webinar, and they'll totally understand. But yeah, so let's move this a little bit further. And when we have those social engineering moments, we have things like leaks and hacks, which we've heard about before. Breaches, ransomware, districts are getting shut down for days, and you think, okay, well, this can happen if you have a major breach. And there's a free tool online. There's several of these sorts of tools out there for hackers. You don't have to have an established breach, something that gets in the newspaper, to be at risk. And Brian, I'd ask you just to explain the graphic that we're looking at here. What is this tool, and what are we seeing?
Yeah, this is one of many tools that exists on the internet, and it's really just showing phished and or stolen credentials. So if for some reason you were phished and you entered your credentials unbeknownst to yourself into an illegitimate website, it gets captured, and these credentials get resold over and over and over again on the internet. This is something that's very easily accessible. This is a district that we just picked randomly. Not to pick on anybody, but ultimately we just wanted to show that how easy it is for these usernames and passwords to get out there. But there's something that's really concerning here, and that is a lot of people use the same credentials, login, username, and password in their professional life as they do in their personal life. So I challenge you to think about the passwords that you use, and are you using the same thing at work that you are perhaps for a bank account personally? And if you do, you can see that it's very easy for your credentials to get out. And there is a personal concern as well that links directly to a professional concern. So really, this is one way adversaries use to log in, not hack in. And this is incredibly simple. There are millions and millions and millions of usernames and passwords out there in spaces that normal people aren't even aware of, and they're getting resold for a significant amount of money. And those unfortunately, those credentials are still valid, and that's what the adversaries use to get into your network.
Well, thanks for that, Brian. And yeah, the first time I saw that particular report, it was quite eye-opening to see that those kind of records are exposed out there. But thanks for explaining that. And it is something that everybody needs to be aware of, that you don't have to have that established breach to be in a compromised place. So let's talk about some things again as leaders in a school district that you can do to help your team think through how to be more secure. And one of the challenging things in education, I think, is navigating roles and access, right? And who has access to what and when. We start to think about, okay, who really needs to have access to our HR system, like one of these super critical systems with payroll and critical data all throughout. Who actually needs to have it, and when do they need to have it? And if you're getting a request at the wrong time, you could get a notification to say, hey, maybe there's something wrong, and you'd be able to check into that. But certainly thinking through your team, who needs to have access to what. If we start to think about that and we start to narrow down to only the folks that really, really need it, we can get ourselves to a better place. And, I guess that takes some work and energy on your part as a leader. You don't need to be super technical to figure that one out, but it does take time with your team. And, where we like to talk about with our clients is, hey, this is your current state. This is where you're starting this journey. And this is your desired state, the place where you're going to be as secure as you can possibly be. I feel like with cybersecurity, it gets overwhelming to really just focus on the desired state. So we like to with this one topic, we'd like to talk a little bit about a mid state. And Brian, I'll just ask you, kind of along those due diligence lines, when we're thinking about roles and access and some of the things that we've already talked about, what does that mid state look like for a school district today, where we could just kind of aim to be, as safe as we reasonably can be, and I would also say in a reasonable time frame to get something like that done.
Yeah, what we're seeing as practitioners is in the SLED space, many organizations are in the very lowest levels of the cyber maturity scale. And what that really means is not understanding where their risks are, not we call it an M&M approach, and it's a nice crispy shell on the outside, but once you get on the inside, it's warm and gooey and sweet. And unfortunately, that lack of maturity really is challenging, as Tim stated, to navigate. So one of the first things we like to do is work with the client and have them adopt a nationally recognized framework. You may be familiar with ISO 27001, the CIS Top 18, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's an array of frameworks out there. But really, the first step is adopting a framework and developing a cybersecurity strategy in alignment with the framework that also aligns with, as we mentioned earlier, compliance and insurance regulations, and prioritizing your initiatives. And really what we're trying to get after here is let's just get started somewhere. But let's get started in a strategic way. Let's not throw things at the wall and see what sticks, because I believe in SLED, what's happened is there's a lot of kind of mismatched solutions taking place, particularly in the investment of technology. Technology will solve everything. And what we're looking for at a mid state is more a combination of people, process, and technology. It takes a combination of all of those things in order for us to have a comprehensive cyber program. The biggest thing here is at that mid state, we get to a place now where we have an understanding of where our true risk lies. And that understanding is incredibly transparent. It's transparent at the executive level, and it's transparent at the engineering or technological level. So now what's happening is we have trust built into that program. So we're really at a mid-state level. We're looking at having a framework implemented. We're looking at alignment with compliance and insurance, and we're looking at a strategy that we can move forward in a way that can be measurable.
Well, thanks for that, Brian. And I it is an important thing, right? Like you have to have a destination in mind to get where you want to go, and having that mid state and kind of have a good understanding of that people and process, like you talked about, as well as the technology, that's important. It's not just boxes and software. There's a lot of other finesse to this, and we're talking about following this data chain of command and protocols that you can put in place. But at the end of the day, Randy, you know this better than anyone. Folks want access to things. Sometimes they feel like they're being left out because they don't have the ability to get into a system or be part of a system. And school districts of all size and structures, different folks need access to different things. They might have had it in the previous, but they don't need it in the new, and they feel like something's not right if they don't have access to that tool. And I think there's a little bit of finesse as a leader to say no. Or as a friend, it's a friend that's asking you to say no in that school district, and you don't want to be Dr. No, but we need to be firm in keeping people where they need to be. Can you address the subtleties of that, of the right way to have the culture to keep people in their lane, if you will, without making them feel like you're just shutting them down every time they want something?
Sure. I think what's important is not saying no, but looking at what are those things that you are trying to address and what are the goals of the organization, how it fits, so that you could turn what may be a no into a yes. And things may not happen immediately. I loved what Brian said as far as talking about this as a journey, and really where are we within an organization. Everybody across the board, including the technology people, need to be involved in that discussion and understand what is needed for an organization as a whole. So if you don't have that, if you don't have people feeling like they belong, and that's something that's happening in technology today, there's not as much of a commitment to the organization, and you're not going to get those things that you really want to do moving into the future. Gartner Incorporated, who's this huge, one of the biggest IT analyst firms that's out there, put out surveys, and I think it was over 4,000 people in the technology field. And what they found is in technology leadership, over 51% of people are actively planning to lead their organizations in technology leadership in the next 2 years. They also found that 29% felt that they were strongly committed to their organization. So how do you get people to buy into what you're doing? We're doing amazing things in California to support our students, and we are doing some amazing things across the nation as far as really bringing our kids into that next level. And we're going to need everybody on board to do that. So it's really having that open door and understanding and knowing that we're not going to have all the answers, but really making sure that it is a collaborative effort. I remember as a superintendent, I saw a couple times when people would want something that they wanted right then and there. I would see email manifestos sent out. This is why I think that all students should have access to this system that, by the way, gives them direct exposure to unfettered exposure or unfiltered exposure to adults on the outside, being able to address and connect with the kids. But this is why I want this, and this is what's going to help. That's not the approach that you want to take as far as people going back and forth, because then people go back into themselves and become defensive. So I think the most important thing that you could do is setting up an environment where you could have those discussions. So it's about how do we get to the point where we are saying yes as opposed to saying no. And that takes a lot of knowledge, and that takes a lot of understanding with people as far as and probably a lot of professional development as well, as far as understanding across the board, because we need to be technological in all positions now, and not just within the technology department.
Thanks, Randy. I like what you said about, instead of just saying no, asking, trying to get down to what people really, really want. What are you really trying to accomplish? And then I think through that conversation, there are going to be some places where you can probably say yes, or get them focused on the right path. And when we start, so we've been talking about who needs to access what and when, kind of having this mid state that addresses the people, the policies, the protocols, and the technology as well. And now when we start to think about professional development around cybersecurity, I bet everyone who's on this call has been through some kind of cybersecurity awareness training, and it's teaching you don't click on this, let's make sure we're more thoughtful. That is awareness training. You start to think about when you've figured out who has access to your most critical systems, who are those people with the keys to these really, really important banks of information. They need to actually have a more advanced version of professional development. So we need to start thinking about that level 2 of PD for those folks that are in control of this incredibly important data or have the most access. And it's not a one-size-fits-all PD approach to cybersecurity in today's world. So that is, as we start to think about who gets what and when, we also need to think about the professional development that those folks need. And I would also say maybe a little bit of the saying no in their boat as well, because it is a bit of a finesse thing, and it is something that will ultimately probably come across their plate as those requests come in to get access to that data. So let's jump ahead here and talking about outsourcing experts. Of course, this is something that we do at Digital Advisors here. We work directly with clients on cybersecurity. We have a wonderful example in Galt School District where Brian worked very closely with them over time. And Brian, can you just explain this this graphic here? Like, what are we looking at with Galt, and what were they able to accomplish?
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, the regards to logging in, not breaking in, one of the first layers of defense that we really like to address is phishing and strengthening the internal team's ability to recognize when an email is potentially nefarious. And the way we worked with Galt and the way we approach all of our clients is we start with a blind test. We work closely with their internal technology team, and we created a blind test of phishing simulation and sent those messages out to every employee throughout the organization. We also worked very closely with the superintendent, who really made the training program and this program mandatory, which I believe really enhanced the output And it really showed the seriousness of cyber and cyber hygiene to the entire staff. So upon sending the initial blind phishing simulation, the staff clicked on 18.6 of the messages that were known bad. And that's incredibly concerning. What we see in the market today is anywhere from 25 to 12% of blind tests. That's what gets clicked, and that's a significant amount. What we're targeting is less than 1% is what we're targeting. After the initial phishing simulation, we then sent out a mandatory security awareness training course that focused on phishing, credential harvesting, and basic ransomware hacks. The entire staff took that on, and we sent a second phishing simulation after the training, months after, in fact. After that training was taken, we went from 18.6 to 7.3. So a significant drop in the amount of clicks on nefarious emails. We then repeated the process. I think it was about 6 months later, we did another training exercise, waited another 3 months, and then ultimately the click rate went down to 3.6%. So as you can see, from an 18.6 on blind with zero cyber awareness training, all the way down to 3.6%. And I truly believe they're going to be getting to that 1 to less than 1% within the next year. The organization is incredibly aware. And what it's really done is it set this foundation of a culture, a cyber awareness culture throughout the organization, that it's being taken seriously, it's important, and ultimately that there are results that are coming from it. So we're very, very thankful of Galt allowing us to use this data. And we see this across the organizations that we participate and we help facilitate these exercises with. So ultimately, this is a really fantastic first step to start increasing the cyber posture.
Thanks for that, Brian. And yeah, congratulations on achieving those results with Galt. Really impressive. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And, we talked about free resources. Everybody who's been on the call today, we're going to send out the CISA report that we mentioned earlier. We'll send out the CDE guidelines if you haven't seen those yet, the CIS Top 18, and a couple of other links. We'll also send this recording if you'd like any folks on your team, perhaps to understand what you learned today, in this webinar. Please feel free to pass that on. But we will do that little. I'll send out a little follow-up email and a thank you for being on today. And with that, I want to jump into any Q&A. If you all have, if anyone on the call has any Q&A, we got our contact information here. And if anyone has any questions, go ahead and just drop them in the chat, and we will do what we can. I think we had a couple of folks email us. In advance with a question or two, and Brian, I believe one of them is actually one of them was like, I'm in a crisis now. I have a ransomware situation, kind of like, where do I start? If I'm misspeaking on that, please let me know.
No, that is accurate. It was I'm in the middle of a crisis, or what happens if a crisis takes place? What do we do? And that's a very challenging place to be. And my heart's out to anyone that's in that situation, because it's incredibly stressful. And really, the first thing is to accept the fact that you've been a victim of a crime. That's really the bottom line here. And it's very similar to your home. You can put a fence up, you can live in a gated community, you can put a moat around your house, you can have locks, etc. If someone wants to break in, they're going to break in. And that's really the first thing, is you've been a victim of a crime. The second thing is I would hope that an incident response plan is in place within the organization. A lot of the times at the maturity levels that we see, that's just not what's taking place. So here are a couple of things that you can actually do if an incident response plan is not in place. Let's assume that cyber liability insurance is in place. That's the first place to start. You want to call them and ensure that the steps you take are in alignment with their incident response procedures, because we have seen claims not get met because the organization has went in a different direction. And the hard thing with that is We want to do something immediately. And sometimes the cyber liability insurance teams are busy and you're not getting an immediate response. If that's the case, the next thing that I would do is contact local law enforcement and your local FBI representative and let them know that I've contacted my cyber liability. I need to be incredibly delicate in the way I handle this because I want to ensure that I do not negate my claim. But ultimately, I want those involved to know what's taking place. The other thing is be incredibly careful in the terminology that's being used and don't claim an incident, because the term incident can have negative implications in terms of what you have to do moving forward. If an incident is actually found, there are legal implications surrounding that. Like you may have to pay for credit monitoring. There may be legal fines. There very well could be system revocation access. So there's a lot of things that happen when you call it, excuse me, I misspoke. It's when you call it a breach. You have to be very, very careful in not calling it a breach and calling it an incident. So calling it a breach has negative connotation, and be very, very cautious in using the term breach. So I apologize for the misuse of my words. But from that point forward, you really want to create an incident response team internally and work very, very closely with your cyber liability insurance claims. And you also want to make sure that you find a certified and authorized incident response firm.